Thank you.
Okay, Lindsay, you can start.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us, wherever you are in the world. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We are very excited today to be joined by Anne Evers and Susan Pittman. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow Susan to actually introduce herself as we take a deep dive into social studies, um, and look at how you can prepare students for the social studies test. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm actually going to hand straight over to you and ask you to please introduce yourself.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lindsay, Marissa, and it's a real pleasure to be with everyone. My name is Susan Pittman. I live in Western North Carolina in the United States. I have worked with the GED testing service for, about 20 years as a professional development consultant. My background comes from the classroom and having worked with adult education students and especially helping to prepare them for the GED test. That's how it all began. And at this point in time, my classroom has just changed. I've moved from working with students who are preparing for the test to working with teachers who now are helping their students prepare for the test itself. So, what I hope I can bring to you today is number one, a little information that should be helpful in terms of the social studies test itself, because as I understand, if you're living in a country other than the United States, you don't learn about U.S. history and the civics and government associated with the U.S. government, with the United States. So, what you know and what you're aware of happens to mostly come from the news or social media itself. So, what we're going to do is we're going to divide this up into several different areas that we can talk about as we go through. Keep in mind that if you want to ask questions, please feel free to do so through the chat. There will be Lindsay, Ann, and Marissa will be monitoring the chat, and if there are questions that come up that need to be addressed, we'll do so. I'll also make sure that we leave some time at the end of the session for you to come in and ask questions as well. So keep all that in mind. But we're going to kind of divide things up. We're going to look at what they say about the GED test. And when I say they, I'm going to talk about the developers, how they determined what was going to be tested, how it's all set up. We're also going to look at areas where you may want to focus instruction. There are certain areas that our students are going to need to have some specific content that they need to learn. So we'll talk about some of those pieces. I'm also incorporating in some examples of social studies questions so that you get a really good feel for what the test really looks like. We'll talk general strategies and some resources, and as I said, we'll wrap up with a session Q&A. My background is in U.S. history. In fact, that was my major in college. So I have a special interest within all this, and hopefully what I can do is share with you some of the key things that can be helpful to your students as you're working with them. So, first of all, you need to keep in mind that with the social studies test, it is so imperative that students have that they work and improve their reading skills. So it's their reading skills in English and also their critical thinking. One of the things that we find with many students who enroll in adult education programs is that they need to improve those skills in order to be able to use higher order reading skills like analysis and evaluation and synthesis, those types of things. Now, there's some areas where they're going to need some specific content around certain topics that are in the social studies test. So we'll talk more about those. But keep in mind that we also know that there are certain questions that students are going to find more difficult. So the expectation isn't there that they are able to answer every question on the test, but that they can answer the questions enough so that they can pass the test itself or obtain a score that may be needed for them as they advance into higher education. So, a few things that you need to be aware of as an instructor working with students. It's very important that you spend some time looking at the GED assessment guide for educators. And you can find that on the GED.com website. There's a specific assessment guide set up for social studies. The reason I refer you to this is it gives you a very, very clear indicator of just what will be covered on the test. And I'll share a little bit more about this as we go through. When we talk about social studies specifically, it's important that you as the instructor understand how heavy this test is into U.S. civics and government, as well as U.S. history. 70% of the test revolves around those two areas. And when we take a look within this, what we notice is that, yes, we have some information here that we need on the different types of modern and historical governments that may be found in many places. But also, it goes very heavily into the structure and design of the United States government, individual rights, civic responsibilities, and other things that you may not be familiar with, and especially your students. When we come into U.S. history, we're certainly looking at an era here where it is very heavy into how the U.S. came to be, and specific parts in history that made us the country that we are. But also recognize that there are other areas that you may have more familiarity with. So keep those things in mind. Here is where we're going to do most of our focus. But economics, geography, and the world should be areas that are much more available to you to or for understanding, and just some of the basics of economics, consumer economics. What do we mean by the difference between micro and macro? So this chart, this matrix, gives you a really nice overview of the topics that are covered within the test itself. And it's important that we understand what's there so that we can kind of put together our approach as a teacher to providing the instruction. Now, the GED testing service has done a lot of research on where people are experiencing difficulties within the social studies test itself. And I'm going to talk about some of those specifically because I want you to notice the types of problems that students are having. If you look at these 5 gaps, you're going to see that the first 4 of these really come back to the whole idea of reading and critical thinking. That's inherent within these 4 areas. So we have to keep in mind that we can have a lot of content knowledge about something. That's an area that's a problematic area, content knowledge. But if our students have difficulty with higher order reading skills and critical thinking skills, that content knowledge is not going to allow them to be successful on these types of questions. So let's take a look at what we mean by this. One thing that's very important is that our students use what we call close reading strategies. And there are some very specific pieces that that make up close reading. Close reading is about reading and rereading so that you can see what's explicitly stated in text, and more than that, you can make logical inferences from it. So our students don't need to be in this mode of how fast can I read, but rather, how well do I pull information from the text that I read? The other thing that close reading requires of our students is that they can see where there's specific evidence that supports conclusions drawn from the text. That comes back to this whole process of understanding what's explicitly and implicitly said within the text itself. And other things, and this will prove very important as we go through and look at some sample questions. Can students identify purpose and assumptions and the implications of what the author is saying? So keep each of those things in mind. So it's slow down, make sure that we can locate the evidence that we need, and analyze what's being read. So those, again, important points that you need to keep in mind, irrespective of whether a student is answering questions about geography and the world, economics, U.S. history, or civics and government. They're going to need these types of skills. And there's another thing. Social studies, as well as science on the GED test, they both have incorporated what we call practices. And those are things that go across all the content areas. I've included this in here because I think it's important that you understand what these practices are so that as you work with students on specific content, that you're incorporating the practices. Every question on the social studies test involves both content and a social studies practice. So we're looking at two specific ways in which we're assessing the information. And you can see from here, and you have plenty of time to read this later, everything from drawing conclusions and making inferences down to interpreting meaning of symbols, words, and phrases, analyzing the purpose and point of view of an author. When we take a look at it, we're also going to find that there's something here called integrating content presented in different ways. And I'm going to show you an example of a question that does just that, so you can have a better understanding of it. And keep in mind that the social studies also requires that students understand graphics, graphs, charts, different data representations that are there. And of course, can students calculate that mean, median, mode, and range of a data set? So all of these things are kind of, think of them as a backdrop to the content that's being laid out there for students. So there's a couple of things that I think it's important that students understand when it comes to social studies practices and indicators, and that's some terms. They need to have the terminology so that they understand what a question may be asking them to do. And keep these things in mind. I mean, we have a simple list here of 10 different types of terminology that all of our students should be familiar with, including such things as chronological order and bias. What do we mean by that? And what do we mean by inference? So as you're working with students, those terms become very important. So let's take a look at a couple. We're going to go through first. We're going to look at where the gaps are, and we're going to look at some sample questions and kind of talk our way through these. So I said before that if a student cannot identify evidence in a passage, to support an inference, they're going to have problems. They need, number one, to know, what do we mean by inference? And many of our students have difficulty in identifying inferences when we come to the text that they're reading. So that means that we've got to make sure that they're paying attention to precise details within text, but also that they're understanding inferences. This is an example, and I want you to take notice of how this question is set up. This has a very short statement here. It's 2 sentences, or really one, including the title of a document. But this is the lead-in to it. And then from this, the student's being asked to make an inference. And it's asking that which statement from the document provides evidence that President Bush believed his national security strategy would require increased U.S. military spending. In this particular type of question, the student doesn't have to know anything about George W. Bush, doesn't have to understand specific military strategy. They just have to know how to make an inference based on what is stated here in the question, which would require increased U.S. military spending. And you can look at each of these elements that are included here, and the student would need to infer from that which one of those really comes back to providing that increased U.S. military spending. So let's take a look at what we're being asked within this itself. There is, as I said, no prior content knowledge required within this. All that the student needs is included here within the question and the different answers that are there. So what we look at here would require is looking at a future event, would require. But when we start looking into each of the items within this, what we found is that this first one is about past actions, and there's no clear implication for the future. This one looks at, we must prepare for more deployment by developing assets, and goes on to explain what those assets is. That one refers to some future action that probably would cost money to do these types of things. This one is about looking at the future. Okay, that's a good point. But it's not looking at how we're going to require increased funding. It looks like how we manage what we have. And this one is about our compatibility, our capability, excuse me, that we will need in the future, but doesn't talk about spending. So B becomes our answer as we're going through. The reason I put this at the very beginning of this is to show you that not all things require content knowledge, but there are some specific questions that will. So reading strategies become an important part of this process, as well as building content that we're going to need. We think often that when it comes to chronological structure or sequence of events, that this should not create any problems for our students. I mean, it's quite simple. We think of a sequence of events as first, second, third, and so on. There are even clues, there are key words, there are signal words that tell us what's happening at a specific point in time. However, the research proved that was very different, because our students were asked to read a passage, again, look at what is explicitly stated, and then their question is, which event described in the passage happened first? What happens with many of our students is that they turn around and they look at this and they see that the very first thing stated up here is the oil tanker ran aground. The very first answer is that the oil tanker, the Exxon Valdez, ran aground. However, if you read through the text and pay attention to the details, the student finds that later in the passage it refers to what had happened earlier that day, and students need to take that into consideration. So we have an event that happened before this. So everything is provided. You don't have to be an expert on the Exxon Valdez. You don't have to know about Prince William Sound. All you have to do is actually read the text and be able to determine what happened first. And in this case, the answer was D. Now we come to something that's where we have a lot of difficulty with our students who do have a lack of content knowledge. This particular list and this question really doesn't have a lead in. It just says which list shows the correct order of steps in a process used by U.S. government branches to check each other. Based on the country where you reside, you may not have a system of checks and balances, or it may work very differently. So in the US, there is a system called checks and balances, meaning that there are three branches of government, and each has the ability to pose a check on others. And as a result of that is to balance out the power within the United States. This is where our students have to have prior knowledge about civics and government. And we'll talk specifically about this, but this creates problems not just internationally, but it's also a problem for those who are taking the test in the US itself, because they have to understand who has what power and how it can be exercised in opposition to another branch of government. So we'll talk about this some more, but again, prior knowledge is required. The next part here, we have a problem because our students have difficulty comparing differing ideas. So what happens on the test is that sometimes, and I'll show you an example, there are different types of text that are provided. In this case, we have an editorial from a U.S. senator, and we have a veto letter from a Missouri governor. Okay, I don't know that senator. I may not be aware of that particular governor. What am I going to do with this? Do I have to have some certain type of background knowledge in order to answer the question? And the answer to that is no, I don't. Which idea is only behind the editorial? So what we have in this particular case is the student has to make a comparison between this editorial and this veto letter. That means they have to read both. They have to understand what is explicitly stated there. What's the evidence that is in there that supports those arguments, so that then they can make a determination. The big question I would have for students and looking at them from an international standpoint is, do they understand something like the term veto and what that means? So, but other than that, the student really, in this particular case, doesn't have to have some specific information about this particular content, which is talking about voter ID laws. All the information is there. It's about being able to use their critical thinking skills, their reading skills to be able to answer. and to not fall into the trap that if we're asking about the editorial, saying that all I need to read is the editorial. They have to read both and make the comparisons. And sometimes we actually have where we have some differing ideas. So in this particular case, once again, we have everything provided within the blog entry and the letter. All the information is there. So the question comes back to how do these differ in their analyses of presidential democracy? So the information is provided. They will need to read, analyze, and evaluate the information that is provided. However, they don't need to come into this session with an understanding of presidential democracy or the US system of government and what parliamentary democracy is. This question is about being able to read. So a few minutes ago, I mentioned the fact that sometimes students have to bring together text from two sources. And on this particular piece, you'll notice that there's a table and there's also a passage, a short narrative. And it says the limits on how long a president may serve, and student reads that. Then they look in the table itself, and they have to combine the information from both to be able to answer a question. So again, they don't have to know coming into this what is the maximum number of years a president can serve, meaning a US president. What they have to do is take the information from both sources to find the answer, which in this particular case, just to give you an idea, is 10 years. Now, we come into an area where we're looking at specific content that our students need to know. What the research showed us is that the content knowledge, there are deficits in civics and government and economics. So here are some recommendations for you about what you can do within this. Now, what I have pulled here on this particular slide is from the assessment guide that I mentioned earlier, where it shows you actual content topics and subtopics. Now, understand if the information that, or if the test question has to cover what is actually laid out as being assessed. So, where do our students have difficulty? Well, in the United States, they're having difficulty in each of these red blocked areas. However, what I would say to you internationally is you want to be sure that the students have some understanding across the board within this. Remember that question on checks and balances? That came in from here. There's also a term called separation of powers. That's knowledge that students, whether they're international or they're domestic, are going to need to have as just a background. They don't need to be authorities on it, but they need to have an understanding of what these things are. So let's take a minute to go through and talk about some very specific areas that can be useful to you in helping your students understand a part of this. So I'm going to start out from this standpoint. In the US, we have a Constitution and we have a Bill of Rights. This particular graphic is focusing on the differences between these two documents and what they mean. because what students will need to know is what is included within the Constitution and what it is all about. But also, this Bill of Rights, what do we mean by that? So this provides you with the meaning, the functions, and where it is housed, or the entity itself. So the U.S. Constitution really is the fundamental principles that are established and presidents, a state, organization, or any other entity has passed to be followed. So our Constitution lays out that general information that about our government itself. It outlines how government, the different arms of government, and by that we mean the three branches, how they function, the basic rules that should be followed, and the rights and limitations of citizens. It's an independent body housing different rules. The Bill of Rights is different. We think of it as the Constitution and Bill of Rights all kind of shoved together, but it is two different documents that outline different things. So the Bill of Rights is a formal declaration of the legal and civil rights that citizens of any country enjoy. So it lists the rights and how the government and other people should protect them. It is housed by the Constitution itself. So there are two separate documents, one that outlines the government itself, one that outlines the rights of U.S. citizens. So when we talk about the Constitution, this is something that students should have a general knowledge of, whether they are international and taking this test or they're domestic taking this test and trying to understand. But we're going to focus here on 4 articles. The Constitution is laid out with various articles that provide information about different aspects of the U.S. government. So this hopefully will be helpful in giving you just a little overview of what we mean and what each component represents. So Article 1 is about Congress. That for the U.S. is the House of Representatives and the Senate. They make up Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch. In this case, we'll put it here as the president is the head of Article 2. Article 3 talks about the court system. And when we talk about separation of powers, that's what we're talking about. Each of these entities has its own powers, the things that are delegated to that entity by the Constitution. Article 4 deals with the states and what is delegated to the states themselves. So let me give you just a little quick overview. The U.S. Congress is given the authority in the Constitution to coin money, to establish a budget, to regulate commerce, set the laws of how commerce works, declare war, and make other laws to carry out powers. Okay, so that sets some limits there. The executive branch, or the president, acts as a commander-in-chief of the military, maintains a cabinet of advisors. That's the one who negotiates treaties, appoints Supreme Court justices, and is responsible not for making law, but for making sure that the laws are carried out. We call it execute laws. Article 3 deals with our court system. The courts interpret the meaning of laws. They decide whether a law is relevant to a particular set of facts. They rule on how a law should be applied, and they determine whether a law is constitutional. notice that they are not there to make other laws. They are there to interpret the meaning of laws. So notice each of these has different powers. That's called the separation of powers. And as a result, we have what we call checks and balances to keep certain things from, say, keep Congress from becoming too powerful and taking over. So let's look at what states. The 50 states can create and enforce their own laws. They have to respect the laws of other states. They have a representative government. And then when you see this term, follow the supreme law of the land, that means the Constitution. Federal law is at the top. So each of these has separate things for which they are responsible. And that allows the government to work in a more effective manner. So how do these bills become laws? And this is something that your students will need to know because it could very well be asked within questions. So this particular chart just shows you how things move from one place to another and who has authority over it. So bills, that's what we call them. A bill is introduced in the House or the Senate. It moves through a committee and it has to get a certain level of vote because there's a debate here within the committee. So they vote with a 2/3 majority. And then same thing in the Senate. Once those bills are passed in either the House or the Senate, or in both, excuse me, it goes to the president who can veto it, which means he basically says no and it's not signed, or he signs it and the bill becomes law. However, Congress can also, they can override a veto, but notice that it requires a 2/3 vote in order to do that. So this is just a general idea of how legislation moves through our government so that students have a general idea of how the process worked. It's a lot more uncomplicated on a daily basis. Now, as you are sitting there across the world in all these different countries, one thing that you may that may appear as a real problem in understanding U.S. history is understanding that we have, in the U.S., evolved over time as to who is allowed to vote. And this particular timeline is important, I think, for you so that you can see generally how things changed within the US over time to allow different groups of people to be able to vote in our elections. So I've included this here just as a way that you can see the progress made over time and also to help students that are going through get a little glimpse of American history. There's a lot more behind all of this, but at least it gives you a general understanding of how things have changed since 1787, when only white male landowners could vote, to the present day, where we have a Voting Rights Act and 18-year-olds can vote. This one you can use for students to look at different events, and then you could follow up from there. But also, it does provide a fairly streamlined approach to looking at U.S. history. So, having said those things, what I want to do is take you for just a few minutes into what I consider to be some essential resources for students on GED.com. All of you know that there is a computer tutorial that's available for students so that they understand how computer testing works and how they can use things like a highlighter, and they can change the size of a font, and they can do these different tech tasks as they're moving through the test itself. There are also social studies study guides that can be accessed. And one area that you as an instructor may want to look at, which is performance level descriptors. So if a student doesn't pass the social studies test, you can actually go in and look at reports and also look at the information from the performance level descriptors to figure out, okay, where should I focus my instruction as I'm going along? There is an archive of what we call Tuesday for Teachers. We do that every other month, which has a lot of information that goes into even more in depth into civic knowledge and resources that may be helpful. And of course, there's a GED and Me mobile app, which is available through Apple, the Apple Store. There are a couple of other things. I gave you just a real quick overview considering the length of time that we had today. But I want to refer you to something that you can access. The World Wide Web is a wonderful thing. We have a lot of different areas where we can access information. So I'm going to start with this one. And if you want to learn more about the Constitution and how the government within the US works, there's this website called Constitution Facts. And it has everything from quizzes that are online to crossword puzzles to help with understanding different social studies vocabulary. It also has different types of puzzles, but a lot of information. If you look across here, the Constitution itself, it talks about the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers, who they are, the Supreme Court. Um, all of this would be useful information for you, but you may want students to take a look at it as well. It gives them more background in a very interactive fashion. Another site, and this I would say is basically for you as an instructor so that you can have a better understanding of civics and government. This particular site is an interactive constitution, and it will allow you to take a look at each of the articles within the Constitution and what they mean. You can go everywhere from looking at the judicial branch specifically to looking at how our Constitution, meaning the US Constitution, can be changed, how it can be amended. Another place is called the Annenberg Guide to the Constitution. And I share this with you because this is one of the sites that I use for a lot of reference material. And they're lesson plans, but just a lot of information for someone who is new to US history and US civics and government. It provides you some of that overview that can be so useful as you're starting out with this process. There is another site that, should you want to pull information that you can use with students, maps, editorial cartoons, a lot of different things, even photographs from US history. The US National Archives has an education division, and they host a site called docsteach.org. And you could use that and share it with students so that you have some samples of materials for students to see. Um, when it comes to working on the test itself, there are photographs, editorial cartoons, maps, timelines, and that's something that students are going to need help with. They need to work with those and have an opportunity to practice. I think you can find those a lot of materials here that are very useful. And one other place that I refer to quite often is Stanford University has a history education group. It is free to register for the site, and again, you can learn some new skills and new strategies. There is an area in here called Reading Like a Historian that provides strategies on how to do close reading with historical or history text. And that can be very useful for your students. So, just some general strategies as we begin to wrap up on this. Um, I think it's important that you spend some time looking at the GED indicators and the content topics. That means you need to go out to the assessment guide and spend some time just reading through so you have a good idea of what is available there. When it comes to working with key foundational concepts and content, um, you are going to need some time to build some content knowledge around U.S. history and civics and government. I hope that what I've done today is I've provided you with some resources that will be helpful in those particular areas. Keep in mind, we want to focus in on content knowledge and civics and government, as well as looking at some of the basics of U.S. history. One of the reasons why today I went through those sample questions was really to remind you, so you can remind your students, that it is so important that they carefully read questions and excerpts that are provided, because understanding that so much information on the GED test, social studies test itself, can be answered by having really strong reading strategies can make a difference. But if they don't use those strategies, then it is their loss. Um, One other thing, we need to encourage students to study key definitions and terms. Remember those 10 terms that we talked about? Propaganda, bias, inference, sequencing, chronological structure. Those are all important things. If there's one thing I would ask that you do when you're working with students in social studies, it is work on those reading skills so that that benefits across all content areas. And you can use social studies information, social studies text to build those reading skills. And encourage your students to analyze the content they read on a daily basis. The way that students become better readers is to practice. And that means that they do need to do that reading on on a frequent basis. You can then refer them to some of the websites that I've listed, which could, again, provide them with a base of information that's included there. So having shared that information with you, what I would like to do is see if Lindsay, Ann, or anyone has any questions that I need to answer, and then we'll try to go from there. So Lindsay, Ann?
Thanks so much, Susan. And this is really valuable information and very insightful. And I think even we've definitely learned a little a bit as you've gone through it. So thank you for that, Susan. It's really insightful. And clearly everyone found it worthwhile too, because we've had several questions on when we're going to be running an RLA one. Um, so clearly it was beneficial. Just some things to note is we will be sending the recording to this out, as well as loading it on our website. And what we are doing is this is the third in our series of quarterly webinars. So every quarter we're going to be hosting a webinar like this. I think our next subject is RLA, which we certainly look forward to presenting in the beginning of next year, in the first 3 months. So thank you, Susan. It was definitely very, very informative and helpful. I think most of the questions on the chat Anne has actually answered. And I think a lot of the questions are, when are we going to be running more of these? Which is fantastic.
And the recording, I just said that the recording will be coming out soon, whenever Marissa gets around to it, but it's probably within a couple of days.
The other thing, Anne and Lindsay, is I will provide this PowerPoint to you, and then they can also link into that so that they have that information as well.
Yeah, and I
Great.
think one of the questions, Susan, that you could possibly help us with right now is to give some suggestions on how to solve questions involving cartoons and charts.
There is a lot of information that needs to be provided on that. One of the big problems that students have with cartoons is the fact that there's usually background knowledge required in order to, so there needs to be some kind of context that they can place it in. So cartoons can be problematic. However, I do have, I believe we have one of the Tuesdays for Teachers webinars that focuses specifically on editorial cartoons and other graphics. So Lindsay and Ann, I will find that located in the archives. And then that way we can get a link to send to everyone, because it does require a little bit more than what we had time for today.
Yeah, and I actually answered about the data literacy skill set itself goes across all 4 content areas and is one of the most difficult skills for all students. And it's in the high impact indicators. So I'd urge you all to go to the high impact indicators and do the cross content areas crosswalk and see if your students are doing really well in looking at a cartoon in RLA, then see how you could also do it in social studies. But yeah, Susan, this topic is quite important, and it is not easy just to say in one sentence or two how to command that skill.
Yeah. And I think it's important to let everyone know that in addition to these quarterly webinars where we're really starting to dive deeper into each subject and each test, we also send out our quarterly prep provider newsletter that's specifically for our authorized prep providers. So obviously, if you're on this webinar, you've been invited, you're one of our educators. If you're not receiving the invites to this webinar, or if you're not receiving our quarterly prep provider newsletter, please reach out to us. You can contact us on international@ged.com. We're really trying to expand the resources that we're providing you to help you with preparing your students for the GED test. So feel free to reach out to us and ensure that you're on our mailing lists. But I think
Susan, do you have anything? There's this one last question that came in about resources related to economics topics. You shared a lot of different websites right now. any of those ones have the economics part to it?
No, I don't, but I can look. Um, because I do know that there are some different things out there. Let me see if I can find some resources, and I will provide them to you, Anne and Lindsay and Marissa, so that what we can do is at least get some links out to some really good sites.
Perfect.
Fantastic. And well, I'm not sure yet if we're going to actually be sharing the PowerPoint. We'll certainly be sharing this recording. But I think with 5 minutes to spare, your timing is absolutely perfect as always, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you as always for being our in-house expert. And Marissa, obviously, for setting everything up. We really appreciate you guys sharing your expertise with us. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you for joining us and taking the time. And we look forward to connecting with you again in our next webinar early next year. Thank you, everyone.